It is November 20th, 2025, and the United Nations Security Council this week passed a resolution which would essentially give the US, give Donald Trump in particular, control over Gaza, which really means giving Israel control over the Gaza Strip, which in other words means that in this case of a genocide, we have those who are perpetrating the genocide now being rewarded, now being given control over the survivors of that genocide. So, what does this resolution really mean? How likely is it to be fully implemented? And of course, why did two key permanent members of the Security Council, China and Russia, choose to abstain instead of using their veto power to make sure that this resolution was not passed? Well, we got into all of that and more with a special guest earlier. So let's take a listen to that conversation now. Joining me now to discuss is Craig Mokhiber, an international human rights lawyer, activist, and a former senior United Nations human rights official. Craig, thanks so much for taking the time to join me.
Thank you, Rachel. Always good to be with you.
It's always good to have you on the show. Now, I want to get your take on the latest here, and I want to start with the resolution itself because it's being referred to by the media as a peace plan for Gaza. But when you look at the text of UN Resolution 2803, the language is extremely vague and it puts the Gaza Strip in the hands of this magical board of peace, which then creates an international stabilization force which reports directly to Israel. So, can you start by taking us through this resolution, what it would actually mean for the Palestinian people in Gaza if it is fully implemented?
Yeah, sure. I mean, first, there is no peace plan. There certainly isn't one contained in this document. And by the way, there is no ceasefire. Since the Donald Trump so-called ceasefire was declared, Israel has literally violated it every single day, killing hundreds of Palestinians, destroying hundreds of civilian homes and other infrastructure, blocking thousands of trucks of aid. And yet, somehow, that is never a violation of the ceasefire. So the ceasefire is a lie. The idea that there is a peace process is a lie. And what we have here in this resolution is a betrayal of historic proportions against not just the Palestinian people, but against the idea of international law and the role of international institutions. I mean, think of it. You have the Security Council that was unable or unwilling to act through more than 2 years of genocide in Palestine, principally because of the US veto, but also because of a lack of a commitment on the part of the other 14 members of the Security Council. And now it finally does act, adopting this bizarre resolution in the midst of a genocide. But instead of acting to enforce international law and to protect the victims and to hold the perpetrators accountable, it adopted this resolution, 2803, that openly flouts international law, that further punishes the victims and rewards the perpetrators of the genocide. Frankly, I've never seen anything quite like this. And as I said in the piece that I wrote from Mondoweiss, even worse, it hands control of Gaza over to the survivors of the genocide, the control of Gaza and the survivors of the genocide over to the United States, which is a co-perpetrator in the genocide. And if that's not outrageous enough, it actually provides for the participation of the Israeli regime in decision making, but not of the Palestinians themselves on decisions about their own rights, their governance in their lives. And what I said is that means that the Security Council has become a mechanism of US oppression and an unlawful occupation of Palestine. And this is a baldly colonial move in the Security Council. It is, I have said, legally ultra vires. The Security Council does not have the power to act outside of international law, and it tramples on the rights of Palestinians in a way that has shocked people who follow these issues, and certainly shocked the Palestinians because virtually every Palestinian political faction, resistance group, Palestinian civil society, the human rights organizations, they have all roundly rejected this colonial grab of Gaza. But one has to ask, what is going on in the minds of the 14 other members of the Security Council who have listed their names on a list of shame that I think will be talked about for generations.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. I'm right there with you. And I think the point about Israel and their involvement in this, I do want to get into that here in a minute. But before we do, I want to talk about the state of the UN Security Council because, of course, as you were noting, you've got 15 total members. 5 of those, China, France, Russia, the US, and the UK, are permanent members with veto power. And for the last 2 years, we've seen, well, really longer, but specifically for the last 2 years, we've seen the US use its veto power anytime there is any kind of meaningful resolution that would possibly call for a ceasefire in Gaza, that would do something to stop the genocide. The US comes in, it vetoes it. But then, with this specific resolution, despite the fact that the representatives from both China and Russia have been openly critical of it and what it entails really for the Palestinians, they chose not to use their veto power. Why do you think that is, and what was your reaction?
Well, I've described this as a perfect storm of complicity. What happened in the council here? Obviously, the U.S., the way it does diplomacy, I've always say that the U.S. normally its diplomats are not very skilled. They're usually quite clumsy, but it doesn't matter because they don't need diplomatic skills because they have power. They have carrots and sticks, and they routinely deploy all of those carrots and sticks in diplomatic initiatives in the United Nations. But this time, I'm told by diplomats, they took it to a really extreme level, really harsh threats and inducements as well that have been offered. So, first of all, you look at the Security Council, there are 5 permanent members. 3 of them have been complicit in the genocide. That's the US, the UK, and France. So don't expect any enlightened performance by those countries. Then you have 2 other permanent members of the Security Council. You mentioned both China and Russia that publicly oppose the ideas of this resolution, and yet they are veto-wielding members who refused to wield the veto. Why? A couple of reasons. One, Russia is engaged in very sensitive negotiations with the Americans on Ukraine. And you will see some of the revelations coming out from Donald Trump show that there has been some rewarding of the Russians on Ukraine after this vote. China is engaged in very sensitive negotiations with the Americans on trade and tariffs. And you will see that the tone has already begun to change on that issue. There are also some reasons that are a bit more humanitarian. The Americans threatened effectively to unleash the dogs of genocide on the people of Gaza if this resolution wasn't adopted and if this plan didn't go forward. So you had delegations thinking this is a terrible thing, but if we don't do it, we're going to see the full-scale acceleration of the genocide again. And then there's a factor that affected all of the 14 other delegations of the Security Council, including Russia and China and all of the others, which is the Palestinian representation in the UN is ostensibly by the state of Palestine. The foreign policy of the Palestinians is ostensibly by the PLO. But in fact, those institutions have been merged into the Palestinian Authority, headed by Mahmoud Abbas. And Mahmoud Abbas and the Palestinian Authority operate under occupation, in some ways as an extension of the occupation. They are under the boot of the Israelis, under the thumb of the Americans, and dependent on the funding of the Europeans and the Gulf monarchies. And the Palestinian Authority dutifully then went forward and told all these states not to block the resolution, to vote for it, or at the very least to abstain and not to veto it. And so when they are consulting, they routinely check for the Palestinian point of view, and the Palestinian leadership there was supporting it quite actively. Now, remember, the Palestinian people have rejected it. The Palestinian political factions and resistance organizations have rejected it, civil society, but they didn't consult those people. They consulted the Palestinian Authority representative in the UN. And then to complete this perfect storm of complicity, Egypt and Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states and the broader Arab group also supported it because they have aligned themselves very directly with the US. Remember, Egypt is the second largest recipient of US foreign aid after Israel, and that aid is principally contingent on Israel serving as the southern security mechanism for the state of Israel. And the Saudis were engaged in these conversations that have now, been revealed for security guarantees that immediately after they were identified as a major non-NATO ally of the US, meaning guaranteed US defense of the regime. And they're in the middle of these negotiations for these advanced fighter jets from the United States. So they have decided their bread is buttered not on the side of human rights and international law or the survival of the Palestinian people, but on their own narrow interests. And all of these pieces came together in what was an absolutely stunning outcome, not just because they abandoned the rights of the Palestinian people, but because this move by the Security Council had contained provisions that are a direct violation of international law and provisions that are ultra vires. That the Security Council, I'll explain that. The Security Council is a product of the UN Charter. Any powers that the Security Council have come only from the UN Charter. The UN Charter is a treaty in international law. It forms a part of international law. It is not above or outside international law. That means that the Council is bound by the terms of the Charter, including that it cannot take acts that are contrary to the purposes and principles of the organization, like the denial of self-determination, the acquisition of territory by force, colonialism, and so on. And it cannot adopt a resolution that contains things that are inconsistent with the provisions of international law, especially rules of international law, excuse me for this terminology, that are so-called jus cogens and erga omnes, which basically just means the highest rules of international law from which there is no exception and that impose obligations on all member states and therefore on the Security Council. Security Council has adopted a resolution that acts outside of and in contravention of the highest rules of international law, effectively approving the colonization of the Palestinian people, erasing decades of resolutions of the UN and provisions, hard provisions of international law on the instructions of the US empire. And not only is this extremely dangerous for the Palestinian people on the front lines now, but it sets an extremely dangerous precedent. As I have said, the Security Council, unconstrained by international law, is an instrument of oppression. And its awesome power can now be mobilized to violate systematically the human rights of anyone around the world if their country doesn't have a veto in the Security Council. It's a very dangerous move, terrible precedent. It has to be opposed every step of the way by all decent people until it comes unraveled. It will come unraveled at some point. It's not a sensible plan that has been laid out here. But in the meantime, I think we all have to really make sure that we are opposing this and holding those 15 members of the Security Council, by the way, including 4 Muslim majority countries, 1 Arab country of Algeria, that up until this point had been the principal advocate of the Palestinian people in the Security Council, as well as Pakistan, Somalia, Sierra Leone, and countries like Guyana and Panama in Latin America, Denmark and Slovenia that had up to this point taken a relatively, for a European country, a very principled position on Palestine, Greece and Korea, which are, have subservient foreign policies to the United States. And then, as I said, 3 complicit states, the US, the UK, and France. And the disappointment that we all feel that neither China nor Russia had the courage or principle to use their veto when the veto has been used repeatedly since the genocide began more than 2 years ago to block the defense of Palestinian human rights. This week on Monday, when that veto was needed to protect Palestinian human rights, it was nowhere to be found.
Wow, I think you summed it up perfectly there. And yeah, when you look at the fact that this vote was held, that those 2 countries abstained, that no one voted against it, and I look at that and I go, okay, did we all just give up, right? Was it just like they got the message and said, okay, we're done, moving on here? Which, of course, it's not as if this is going to wrap everything up in a nice, pretty bow, right? This is not solving the Palestinian question in any way. As you were pointing out earlier, Israel is still carrying out attacks. I mean, that was one thing that stood out to me, was that China's UN ambassador brought up this fragile, severe situation in Gaza and the imperative of maintaining the ceasefire. But there hasn't been a ceasefire because Israel keeps violating it. They killed at least 28 Palestinians, including women and children, with strikes across Gaza on Wednesday alone. And when you look at the current situation there and kind of what we're hearing from Hamas and the other Palestinian factions in the joint statement that they released, in which they called out the fact that this resolution restricts the Palestinian people's right to self-determination and to managing their own affairs, then where do you see this situation going from here when it comes to kind of what the Palestinians are in for and what the U.S. is going to try to force on them?
Well, it's quite extraordinary. I mean, normally when you see an international institution respond to a genocide, it responds by holding the perpetrator to account and providing protection and redress for the victims. That's the sort of idea that's just instinctive to anybody who follows these issues. For the first time, what we see is this resolution being adopted not only to empower the perpetrators more and to punish the victims and to weaken the victims in every way, but actually to extend the illegal occupation of Palestine, actually to continue the genocide by other means, because this is something which isn't seeking to, there's no provision in here on disarming or reining in the perpetrator regime of Israel. But there are several provisions that are focused on disarming and reining in the Palestinian victims of the genocide. And it's some of the outrageous things it does. It would hand control of Gaza over to a U.S.-led, in fact, a Donald Trump by name led colonial body that they're calling, in an Orwellian term, the Board of Peace. And it will deploy a proxy occupation force, also directed by the U.S., that they're calling the International Stabilization Force. And both of them answering ultimately to Donald Trump himself. And both of, excuse me, a bit of a cough today. And both of them functioning in consultation with the Israeli regime, which is the unlawful occupying power and the perpetrator of the genocide. I mean, just imagine that. It explicitly rejects all of the recent findings of the International Court of Justice. So it openly denies Palestinian self-determination. It reinforces Israeli impunity, even as I've said, as the genocide continues in both Gaza and in the West Bank. It strips away whatever crumbs and hopes of self-determination the Palestinians in Gaza had, and empowers hostile foreign forces to govern them, including at the head of that, one of the forces that was the co-perpetrator of the genocide. The International Court of Justice ruled last year that the entire occupation of Gaza is completely illegal and has to end quickly and completely, as well as the West Bank and East Jerusalem in that. This resolution pushes that aside. It extends the Israeli occupation. It endorses the indefinite presence of Israeli troops around the so-called security perimeter. And then it superimposes another occupation, the US-led occupation, on top of the Israeli occupation. I said you have to be extremely creative to think of a plan so nefarious that is so in direct contradiction to the requirements of international law as defined by the International Court of Justice, by the way, to come up with these kinds of provisions. And, one of the great achievements of last year was this International Court of Justice advisory opinion that made very clear that the Palestinians, after 30 years of being duped and abused by the so-called Oslo process, the court has said they don't have to negotiate for their rights with their oppressors. Those are inalienable human rights, and that no political agreement or political process can trump those rights. This goes in exactly the opposite direction. It nullifies those rights and gives the discretion of Palestinian rights to the United States and Israel and their other partners in this endeavor. In the middle of a genocide, it doesn't even mention the genocide, the apartheid that the court has found, the colonization, unlawful of Palestine. It never mentions the thousands of Palestinians being held in Israeli torture camps and death camps. There is no accountability for the perpetrators or redress for victims. And the court has also said that Israel is responsible for compensation and reparations for the damages that it has done. This resolution takes that responsibility away from the Israeli regime, that legal responsibility, and hands it off to international donors and the World Bank and international financial institutions, which I have said is a multi-billion-dollar bailout of the Israeli regime in the middle of a genocide, and then pushes forward this plan for normalization of Israel. And then the second main piece of this, you have this Trump-headed so-called Board of Peace, which is this 19th century colonial body that will rule over the Palestinians for the benefit of Israel. and you have this proxy occupation force that they call the International Stabilization Force, the principal focus of which is not to protect Palestinian civilians from Israeli abuses in the genocide, but to control the Palestinian people and to protect the Israeli regime. It is more outrageous than one could conjure up in their worst nightmares, and it gives expansive powers, undefined, to Trump and his body to take whatever actions they want to take. It was an effort to kind of legalize the blatantly illegal actions of Trump and his cronies. And what did the Palestinians get in this? Nothing. Not even a promise of what the world has repeatedly said: two-state solution. You'll get a state. You'll get a Bantustan somewhere down the road, and so on. It didn't even do that. Instead, it basically. And the court has said that, and international law says that the Palestinians are immediately entitled to that. But this thing sets back the cause of Palestinian freedom. It gives this very vague, hyper-qualified, non-committal line that says, after the Trump-led bodies decide that the Palestinians may have met some undefined reform and development criteria, then conditions may finally be in place for a credible pathway to Palestinian self-determination and statehood, and any such process to those ends is to be controlled explicitly by the United States as Israel's proxy. So it effectively has erased even where we were the day before the resolution, which was not in a very good place. The Security Council has given the United States a veto over Palestinian self-determination in a blatant violation of international law. And you would say, well, some of these delegations, they say, well, at least, there'll be some humanitarian benefit of that. Even that is not in this resolution. You had the International Court of Justice saying that all these restrictions on aid have to end, that these were, war crimes and crimes against humanity. This resolution doesn't even demand the unfettered flow of aid. All it does is include some rhetorical language that underscores the importance of humanitarian aid. And if you know how the Security Council functions, they have the power to demand and to decide, which is mandatory language. They didn't do that. All they said, yeah, we know humanitarian aid is important and we will control it. It doesn't say this explicitly, but their intention is to control it for political reasons, as they've been doing throughout the genocide. So, it's about as bad as it could get, Rachel.
Wow. Yeah. The more I listen to you really lay it out in detail, I'm going, it's shocking to me that they passed it. The last thing that I want to bring up goes back to kind of the conversation that we were having about the way that the international system has dealt with Palestine. Because I feel like when you look at Russia and China, they keep going back to this magical idea of a two-state solution. And they look at the Palestinian Authority and they're like, oh, yeah, that's our representative. But the Palestinian Authority is not standing for the Palestinian people clearly. And on top of that, just to throw it in all of our faces, the US and Israel have made it very clear that they're not even okay with the PA running Gaza, right? That they have to create this other force, or in this case, basically leave it up directly to Donald Trump. So where does that leave us when it comes to what that means for Palestine when we keep having this magical idea of a two-state solution, yet as you just noted, the Security Council just passed a resolution where that's never going to happen because it's constantly in the hands of the US and Israel to determine what a potential state eventually maybe looks like.
Yeah, and Benjamin Netanyahu, the prime minister who has been indicted by the International Criminal Court for crimes against humanity and remains a fugitive, declared very clearly before and after the vote that there will never be a Palestinian state as long as he is around. And that was taken as reassurance to an Israeli public that has, after decades of propaganda and indoctrination, become unfortunately supportive of these kinds of crimes. And the U.S. under Donald Trump has been very clear, too, that even this illusory, vague promise of a Bantustan somewhere down the road, even that is not supported by the current U.S. government. And even if it was, all of these initiatives on the two-state solution have been focused not on the liberation of the Palestinian people, not on their equality, not on international law, which they've had to violate in order to make this happen, but on protection of Israel, political Zionism, and its colonial plan for Western Asia. Because there's nothing left for a two-state solution that would be a viable, sustainable Palestinian state in these little specks that are left on the West Bank and in a totally devastated Gaza. And even if you could get an Israeli government to withdraw from all of the West Bank and Gaza and East Jerusalem, which there's no one in the Israeli public that supports that other than a very, very tiny fringe of the society. Even if you could do that, it wouldn't address the fundamental human rights guaranteed by international law of two categories of Palestinians. First, Palestinians living inside the Green Line, who would be relegated to permanent second-class citizens in an apartheid regime because it's an ethno-nationalist state that denies the rights of the indigenous people, second-class citizens, and it completely ignores the human rights of the millions of Palestinians living in forced exile in the diaspora, in the surrounding region of Western Asia, but also in countries all around the world, who have a right under international law to return in compensation, which would be denied by any such thing. The only principled and lawful way forward would be a single democratic state with equal rights for Christian, Muslims, and Jews, decolonization of Palestine, an end to this ethno-nationalist Zionist regime, and a new dispensation based upon international human rights, equality, international law, the right for all Palestinians to return and be compensated and to live in full equality. No one among the formal institutions and states of the world is defending that lawful vision. Instead, they go through all of these diplomatic gymnastics in order to accommodate an oppressive apartheid state that is perpetrating genocide and serial aggression across the region. It is really unbelievable the lengths to which the international system is willing to twist itself into knots to accommodate this. The rest of the world, they were very comfortable for 30 years saying two-state solution, Oslo, negotiations, peace process, all of which was a ruse, a smokescreen behind which the Palestinian people were increasingly dispossessed, persecuted, murdered, imprisoned, had their homes stolen, their institutions torn down, their olive trees destroyed, and the expansion of Israeli settlement and land grabs across the West Bank and Gaza, and a decades-long siege of the civilian population of Gaza with very little outcry from the international community. So this is the next chapter in the oppression of the Palestinian people. The United Nations Security Council is not coming to save it. All of the hope for a more humane approach to this question comes only from the people, from social movements, from civil society, from all of us, who must continue to stand up through boycott and divestment and sanction and legal prosecutions of Israeli perpetrators and education and mass demonstrations and civil disobedience and direct action, and using international institutions when we can. There is still a movement around the United Nations from civil society groups in Palestine working in solidarity with people around the world to try to get the General Assembly, which is a more democratic body than the Security Council, to take up the cause of Palestine, not just with rhetorical declarations, but with adopting, under the so-called Uniting for Peace that we talked about last time mechanism, adopting resolutions that would include sanctions on Israel, a military embargo on Israel, the rejection of Israel's credentials in the United Nations, the reactivation of the anti-apartheid mechanisms, the establishment of a tribunal or other accountability mechanism, and the deploying of a real protection force to Palestine to protect civilians, not to interfere with Palestinian self-determination and governance. That cause has been set back by this atrocity in the Security Council, but the activists involved have not given up, and they will, as they oppose this current arrangement and look forward to it coming unraveled, which eventually it will. They want to have a core group of states in the UN ready to move forward on something based not on the violation of international law and the abandonment of the Palestinian people, but on the enforcement of international law and the self-determination of the Palestinian people.
Yeah, I think that's an important reminder that the fight continues on and that there are a number of things that can be done that are not directly rewarding Israel for committing a genocide, which is what we're seeing currently. Certainly a lot at stake here all around. And I really appreciate you taking the time to join me today to break down all of the latest here. Craig Mokhiber, an international human rights lawyer, activist, and a former senior United Nations human rights official. Thank you so much for your time and insight.
Thank you, Rachel. Happy to have the conversation.
If anything in this video resonated with you, be sure to like it, share it with your friends, leave a comment, and as always, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to keep up with all of my work, make sure that you're subscribed to my page on Substack. That's rachelblevins.substack.com. That's where you'll find ad-free videos and new weekly episodes of my exclusive series for paid subscribers called Sanctioned. You can also check out Sanctioned over on my page on Patreon. That's patreon.com/Rachel Blevins. As always, thank you all so much for all of your support, and I'll see you next time.